Julia Hartwell stood bleeding through a borrowed gray shawl, while the auctioneer raised his gavel and called her useful stock to a crowd that would not meet her eyes. Her left arm hung bound against her ribs. Her lip was split from the wagon crash, and still Silas Brand smiled as if pain made a body cheaper. "Whole, take this nurse and her debt," he shouted. "She can stitch, cook broth, and keep quiet." Laughter rolled across the dusty square until the blacksmith stepped out of his forge smoke, broad-shouldered and soot-streaked, with a hammer still in one hand. Angus Fitzroy did not shout. He only looked at Julia like she was a person, not a bargain. Before we ride into this story, let me know what country you are watching from. Comment your country below, and subscribe if you love emotional cowboy stories about shame, rescue, forgiveness, and second chances. The morning sun hung white over Mercy Crossing, turning the town square hard and bright as bone. Wagons stood wheel to wheel near the feed store. Horses stamped at flies. Men leaned against hitching rails with their thumbs hooked in their belts, and women gathered beneath parasols, pretending they had come for flour or thread, and not for the ugly little show rising on the courthouse steps. Julia Hartwell had been in town less than 24 hours. By noon, they had put a rope around her waist. It was not tied tight enough to bruise, but it lay there for all to see, looped like a claim. Her dress was clean only in the places rain had touched it during the long ride from the wreck stage. Dust darkened the hem. Her left sleeve had been cut open and pinned shut where the bone beneath had not broken but had swollen cruelly. A bandage crossed her temple. Another wrapped her hand. Every breath tugged at her ribs. She had spent the last 3 years nursing fever patients, dressing wounds, and sitting beside the die, without asking whether they were rich enough to deserve comfort. Now the town looked at her as if her kindness had been a poor investment. Silas Brand, the auctioneer, wore a red waistcoat too fine for a town that still had more mud than sidewalks. He held a ledger in one hand and a small walnut gavel in the other. His black mustache curled at the ends, and his smile was sharp enough to cut string. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called, "the matter is plain. Miss Julia Hartwell arrived in Mercy Crossing owing board, carriage fees, medical expense, and indemnity for damaged goods on my stage line. Since she carries no money and no kin willing to answer for her, her labor contract is offered for fair purchase." Julia lifted her head. "There is no contract." Her voice came rough, but it carried. A few people shifted. Someone coughed. Silas did not look at her. "There is debt. I was injured in your stagecoach when the wheel came loose. That wheel was inspected in Denver. The axle bolt had been filed thin." A ripple moved through the crowd, then died under Silas Brand's cold stare. He raised the ledger. "A wounded woman with wild accusations is still a debtor. She claims to be a nurse. Let some decent household take her in and make use of her before she becomes another burden on the church." The word burden struck harder than the rope. Julia looked toward the church at the edge of the square, where a white steeple rose above cottonwoods. She had slept on the kitchen floor there the night before, after Reverend Bell's wife gave her water and a quilt. By dawn, Silas Brand's men had come with paper and threats. The Reverend had been away tending a deathbed 20 miles out, and Mrs. Bell had cried as they took Julia down the steps. No one had stopped them. Julia told herself not to tremble. A nurse did not tremble in front of blood. A nurse did not tremble when fever took a child or a bullet tore a man open. But public shame was a different sort of wound. It did not bleed where hands could bind it. "First bid," Silas called. $5 for 6 months' service. A laugh came from near the saloon. "Can she lift a wash bucket?" someone asked. "With one arm?" another said. Silas smiled wider. "Then $3. Julia closed her eyes. She thought of her mother's wedding brooch, lost when the stage overturned into the wash. She thought of the carpet bag with her nurse's certificate, gone beneath spilled freight and floodwater. She thought of the letter that had brought her west, promising work at Mercy Crossings Infirmary. When she arrived, bruised and late, Dr. Phineas Mercer had glanced at her torn dress and said the position had already been filled. A woman too late was easy to discard. A woman without papers was easier. $2, Silas said. Surely someone needs a quiet pair of hands. Julia opened her eyes and saw the blacksmith across the square. Angus Fitzroy stood in the open door of his forge. He was a large man, tall and thick through the shoulders, with sleeves rolled above forearms browned by heat and work. His hair was dark, his beard trimmed close, and a pale scar crossed his jaw. Soot marked his cheek like war paint. He did not move quickly. He watched like a man measuring iron before the strike. Julia had noticed the forge when Silas' men dragged her past that morning. She had heard the ring of hammer on anvil, steady, patient, unhurried. It had sounded like the only honest thing in town. Now Angus stepped into the street. The crowd parted before he reached them, not from affection but from caution. Mercy Crossing knew Angus Fitzroy as a man who spoke little and smiled less. He shoed horses, mended wagon rims, repaired hinges, and lived alone beyond the creek in a stone-walled cabin he had built himself. Children dared one another to knock on his door at dusk. Men did not insult him unless drunk. Women called him civil, which meant he frightened them but had never given cause for complaint. Silas Brand lowered the gavel a little. "Morning, Fitzroy. You need something mended." Angus climbed the courthouse steps until he stood between Julia and the crowd. His voice was low. "Untie her." Silas blinked, then laughed. "This is a lawful auction." "No, no, no." Angus looked at the rope around Julia's waist. "That is not law. That is a man dressing cruelty in Sunday clothes." A hard silence fell. Julia stared at him. She expected anger in his face, perhaps disgust or reluctant charity. She found neither. His eyes were gray, steady, and tired in a way she understood. He looked at her injuries first, then her face, as if asking permission to care that she hurt. Silas tapped the ledger. "You offering payment, then?" "I am offering witness," Angus said. "She says your stage failed." "She says many things. So do boats when they shear." Silas' smile thinned. Angus turned to the crowd. "That stage was brought to my yard at dawn. The left axle bolt did not break from road wear. It was cut halfway through and cracked the rest. I told Brand's driver the same." A murmur rose fast. Silas' face colored. "You had no right examining my property. It landed against my fence. That woman owes me money." "She owes you nothing until a judge says so. The judge is in Laramie." "Then keep your gavel down until he returns." Silas took a step closer. "Careful, Blacksmith." Angus did not move. "Untie her." The auctioneer's 2 men came up the steps. One was lean, one round, both wearing pistols low. Angus held only his hammer. He did not lift it. Somehow that made the hammer more frightening. The lean man reached for Julia's rope. "Not to pull," Angus said. The man froze. "To untie." The crowd watched. The rope fell from Julia's waist and dropped in the dust at her feet. She wanted to step away from it, but the world tilted. Pain flashed white under her ribs. She swayed once. Angus caught her by the good elbow, gentle as if handling cracked porcelain. "I can stand," she whispered. "I know," he said. "You shouldn't have to." The words were so simple that tears threatened. Julia swallowed them down. Silas Brand looked over the crowd and saw the moment slipping from his hand. "You take her then. Feed her, house her, answer for whatever lies she tells. But mark me, Fitzroy, that does not vanish because a lonely man wants to play savior." Angus looked at him for a long second. Then he bent, picked up the rope, and laid it across Silas Brand's polished shoes. "She's not a thing to take," Angus said. "She can decide where she goes." Every face turned toward Julia. Choice should have felt like freedom. Instead, it felt like a cliff edge. She could not walk far. She had no job, no papers, no family, and no money. The church had already been threatened. The doctor had shut his door. The crowd had already seen her priced lower than a worn saddle. Angus waited. He did not speak for her. Julia gathered what dignity remained and pulled her torn shawl tighter. I would like to sit down somewhere that is not an auction block. A faint breath moved through the crowd, almost laughter, almost shame. For the first time that day, Angus Fitzroy's mouth softened. My forge has a chair, he said. Julia stepped down beside him. Each stare a battle she refused to lose. No one clapped. No one apologized. But the crowd opened, and Angus walked at her pace, slow enough that no one could pretend she had been dragged. Behind them, Silas Brand called out, "This is not finished." Angus did not turn. Julia did. Her voice shook, but it did not break. "No, Mr. Brand, I do not believe it is." The forge was warmer than the street and smelled of coal smoke, hot iron, leather, and rain-soaked wood drying near the wall. Horseshoes hung in rows. Tongs and hammers rested in their places. A great black anvil stood at the center like an altar to work. The chair Angus had promised was plain, but it held her without judgment. Julia sank into it and pressed her good hand against her side. Angus closed the door halfway, leaving enough space for light and air. He did not close her in. "You need a doctor," he said. "I met the doctor, Mercer. He told me he had no position for a nurse who could not prove she was one." Angus's jaw tightened. Julia attempted a dry smile. He did offer to send a bill. Angus crossed to a shelf, poured water from a blue pitcher into a tin cup, and brought it to her. He held it until her fingers steadied around it, then let go. "Hey, ça do," she said. He nodded once. For several minutes there was only the crack of the forge fire and the distant mutter of the town outside. Julia drank slowly. Her throat ached from dust and humiliation. The water tasted of iron and clay, and it was the finest thing she had ever swallowed. Angus moved about the shop with quiet purpose. He took a clean cloth from a drawer, washed his hands in a basin, then paused several feet away. I look at that bandage." The question undid her more than the water. All morning men had pulled, priced, accused, and decided. Angus asked. Julia held out her injured hand. "I am usually on the other side of this arrangement. I expect you'll tell me if I do it wrong. I expect I will." He almost smiled again. His hands were large, scarred from years of heat and iron, but careful. He unwound the dirty cloth from her palm and exposed a cut deep enough to trouble him. He did not whistle or curse, but his eyes darkened. "Glass?" he asked. "Stage lamp. It broke when we turned over. Any pieces left inside. I removed 2 last night. With one hand, I had teeth and stubbornness." This time the smile came, faint but real. It changed him, not into a softer man, but into a man who had been soft once and still remembered how. He cleaned the cut with boiled water and carbolic from a small brown bottle. Julia hissed despite herself. "Sorry," he said. "Don't be. Pain means the hand is still mine." Angus looked up at that. "You talk like someone who has had to argue with loss." Julia flexed her fingers. "Nurses do not win many arguments with it." He wrapped her hand in clean linen. "You saved people. I tried, and mercy crossing turned you onto a block." The words held anger, but not at her. Julia looked around the forge. Above the shelf hung a small wooden horse, carved by an untrained but patient hand. Beside it was a child's cracked cup. Both had been dusted recently. She looked away before her gaze became trespass. "I did not come here to be pitied, Mr. Fitzroy." "Angus, I did not come here to be pitied." "Angus, I am not pitying you. What would you call it? Recognizing a wrong thing when it is being done." She had no answer for that. Her stomach gave an empty twist, loud enough to shame her. She pressed her arm across it, but Angus had heard. He crossed to a small iron stove in the corner and lifted a cloth from a plate. There was cornbread, 2 boiled eggs, and a heel of cheese. "I ate before dawn," he said, which was likely a lie. "I have no money." "I did not ask for money. That is what makes it dangerous." He set the plate on a stool beside her. "Food is not a bargain. In my experience, everything becomes a bargain when a woman is desperate." Angus stood still. Then he removed his hat, though they were indoors already, and held it in both hands. "My wife died thinking that," he said quietly, "that every kindness would come due. I never found a way to convince her otherwise before fever took her." The forge seemed to draw a breath. Julia's hunger remained, but something in her hardened edge loosened. "I'm sorry," she said. He put his hat back on. Miss Hartwell, then we will decide what comes next." "Julia," she said. He nodded. "Julia." She ate because pride did not heal ribs, and because he turned away to give her the mercy of privacy. While she chewed, Angus pumped the bellows and returned to a strip of iron waiting in the coals. The fire breathed orange. He pulled the metal free and began to hammer. Each strike rang through Julia's bones. Not violent, not wild, measured. He was making a hinge, she realized. Something meant to help a door swing true. Outside, Boots approached. A shadow crossed the doorway. A boy of perhaps 8 stood there, hat in both hands, eyes wide. His shirt was too small at the wrists. Behind him hovered a girl a few years younger with a braid coming loose. "Mr. Fitzroy," the boy said. "Ma says our stove latch broke again." Angus set down the hammer. "Your ma fever still?" The boy nodded. Julia set the plate aside. "How high?" Both children stared at her. "Her fever," Julia said gently. "Is she sweating? Chilled? Talking strange?" The boy swallowed. "She says there's bluebirds in the ceiling." Julia stood too fast and nearly folded. Angus was beside her before she fell. "You can't walk to Millie Carter's," he said. "I can, if there are bluebirds in the ceiling. Your ribs say otherwise." "My ribs are not in charge." Angus looked at her for one long moment, then took his coat from a peg. "Then I'll hitch the wagon." Julia did not argue. The children looked from one to the other as if they had just seen a gate open where a wall had been. Within 10 minutes, Angus drove her through town in a blacksmith's wagon. People watched from porches. Silas Brand stood outside the saloon with Dr. Mercer, both men wearing expressions polished smooth over anger. Julia kept her face forward. At the far end of town, in a 2-room house with laundry stiff on the line, Millie Carter burned with fever while 3 small children sat frightened on the floor. Her husband was away with a cattle drive, and the neighbor woman had done all she knew. Julia forgot the auction. She forgot the rope. She became what she had always been. She asked for boiled water, clean cloth, willow bark, cool compresses. She checked Millie's pulse and breathing, examined the rash at her throat, and coaxed her through spoonfuls of broth. Angus carried water, chopped kindling, kept children from underfoot, and never once questioned an instruction. By sunset, Millie's fever had eased a fraction. Not enough for celebration, but enough for hope. The oldest boy, Caleb, followed Angus to the wagon. "Sir," Angus turned. "You bought the nurse?" Julia stiffened. Angus crouched so his face was level with the child's. "No, nobody bought her. But Mr. Bransett, Mr. Ransett, Brand was wrong." Caleb looked toward Julia. "Then why'd she come?" Angus glanced back at her, and something unspoken passed between them. "Because she chose to," he said. Julia felt those words settle over the place the rope had been. That night, Mrs. Bell insisted Julia sleep again at the church, but Silas Brand sent a message before dark. Any person sheltering the debtor would share liability for her account. Reverend Bell had returned by then, weary and furious, yet his church owed money for winter coal, and Brand held half the town's notes. Julia heard the argument from the kitchen. She put on her shawl. Angus waited outside with his wagon, as if he had known. "I can sleep in the livery," she said. "No, the schoolhouse. No, Mr. Fitzroy. Angus, I will not be another debt laid at your door." He looked down the dark street where the saloon lamps burned yellow. My door is mine, he said. I decide what is laid there. The cabin beyond the creek was not grand. It stood against a low rise, built of stone and timber, with a forge shed to one side and a corral behind it. Inside, Angus lit a lamp and opened the door to a small room with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a quilt folded at the foot. My sister stayed here one winter, he said. She is married in Oregon now. The lock works from your side. Julia stood in the doorway. Weariness pressed down so hard she could barely breathe. What will people say? They have said enough for one day. Your reputation matters. It has been poor company. She looked at him then, truly looked. He was not only strong, he was lonely in a house that had kept space for ghosts. I will earn my keep, she said. I expect you will heal first. I mean it. I heard you. He stepped back, giving her the room, the lamp, the choice. Julia crossed the threshold by herself. Morning at Angus Fitzroy's cabin began before sunrise, when the sky was still blue-black, and the creek spoke softly under a skin of mist. Julia woke to the sound of an axe striking wood. For one confused second, she thought she was back in the nurse's dormitory in St. Louis, hearing wagons on cobbles. Then pain pulled her west again. She sat up carefully. On the chair beside the bed lay her dress, mended where the sleeve had torn and brushed cleaner than she had left it. Beside it rested a folded blue work apron, and a note written in blunt, tidy letters. Use what you need. Coffee on the stove. I will knock before entering. Julia touched the note as if it were a bandage. In the main room, the stove held a low fire. Coffee sat warm. A sack of flour, beans, and potatoes occupied one corner. The place was spare but cared for. Shelves held tin plates, a Bible with worn corners, 2 books on horseshoeing, and a chipped blue vase with no flowers in it. She found Angus outside splitting cottonwood. His shirt clung dark between the shoulders. He moved with the same rhythm as his hammering, saving strength by refusing waste. You should be resting, he said without turning. You should have woken me. You were sleeping. I do not sleep through work. You did today. She stepped onto the packed earth carefully. Then give me work that will not offend my ribs. He set the axe down and faced her. Can you sort nails? I can sort nails. Can you write? When my hand stops throbbing beautifully, his gaze moved to the bandage. Can you sit in the forge and tell me when I'm being foolish? That requires no hand at all. He gave her a look that might have been amusement and led her to the shed. So began the first week. Julia sorted nails, cleaned small tools, recorded accounts, while Angus dictated names and amounts from memory, and boiled bandages for Millie Carter, who slowly returned to herself under Julia's care. She learned that Angus undercharged widows, overcharged men who kicked horses, and accepted pies as payment from families he knew had no cash. He learned that Julia hummed hymns when concentrating, could diagnose a child's ear infection from across a room, and grew sharp as a cactus when anyone suggested she was too fragile to be useful. They did not speak of the auction unless forced. The town spoke of little else. Some came to stare, some came to test. A ranch wife named Hester Pike arrived with a torn glove and a mean tongue, asking whether Angus now traded blacksmithing for charity cases. Julia took the glove, stitched the seam, and asked whether Mrs. Pike preferred her cruelty mended too, or only the leather. Angus coughed into his fist until Hester left red-faced. After that, fewer women tested Julia aloud. Children came more openly. Caleb Carter brought his youngest sister when she swallowed a plum pit. A Mexican vaquero named Tomas came with a burn from a coffee pot. Old Mr. Vale came with a cough he insisted was nothing until Julia listened to his chest and told him stubbornness was not a medical treatment. Word spread that the injured nurse could still nurse. Money did not spread with it. Julia kept a small jar on Angus's shelf for payments. Some dropped coins, some dropped eggs. One child dropped a button and a peppermint. Julia kept both. At night, she and Angus ate at the same table, usually in silence comfortable enough to frighten her. She was accustomed to silence that punished. This silence made room. One evening, rain came hard, drumming on the roof and turning the yard to black mud. Angus sat near the stove repairing a bridle. Julia changed the dressing on her hand, pleased to see the cut closing cleanly. "You've done that 1,000 times," he said. "More. Does it get easier?" "What?" Seeing hurt, Julia considered lying. "No, but you stop being surprised that people survive it." Angus pulled the leather through his fingers. "And if they don't, then you sit with them so they are not alone." The bridle creaked softly. "My wife was alone," he said. Julia went still. Angus did not look at her. "I was at the forge when the fever turned. Thought I had until morning. Thought work mattered because medicine cost money. By the time I came in, she was gone. My daughter too." 2 days later. The rain seemed to hush around the words. Julia had suspected loss from the wooden horse and child's cup. Hearing it named made the cabin smaller and more sacred. "What were their names?" she asked. His hand stopped. "People often asked how they die. Few asked who they were." "Eleanor," he said. "And Ruth?" Julia repeated them softly, not as comfort, but as witness. "Eleanor and Ruth." Angus stared at the leather in his lap. Town brought food for a week, then they brought advice. Then they stopped bringing anything, which was better. Grief makes people clumsy. It made me angry. Maybe anger was easier to carry. He looked at her then. Outside, thunder rolled far off over the plains. "I built this cabin for noise," he said. A woman singing. A child asking too many questions. Chairs scraping. Doors opening and closing. After they die, every board in it sounded wrong. Julia did not reach for him. She sensed he would bear pain, but not pity. Instead, she looked toward the chipped blue vase. "Tomorrow," she said, "we should put wildflowers in that." He followed her gaze. "Why?" "Because empty things should not always have the last word." The next day, Angus brought home a handful of sunflowers and purple prairie clover, roots and dirt still clinging, because he had pulled them like fence posts. Julia laughed until her ribs ached. "You were supposed to cut them," she said. "They looked attached." They were. I thought flowers needed all their parts. She trimmed them properly and set them in the vase. The cabin changed by a measure too small for strangers to notice and too large for Angus to ignore. Trust grew that way, not in speeches, in a cup of coffee set near her good hand, in Julia remembering to save Angus the crisp edge of cornbread, in Angus driving her to Millie Carter's without being asked, in Julia cleaning the child's cup on the shelf, then placing it back exactly where it had been. 2 weeks after the auction, her ribs hurt less. Her hand no longer bled. Her arm remained tender, but she could lift a kettle halfway. "I can move to the church now," she said one morning. Angus was filing a horseshoe. The file scraped once more, then stopped. Is that what you want?" "Want" was a dangerous word. Julia looked through the forge door at Mercy crossing, waking under pale light. She could see Silas Brand's office beside the freight depot. She could see Dr. Mercer's sign. She could see townspeople who had learned to nod at her but not yet apologize. "I want to stand where no one can say I hid behind you," she said. Angus set down the file. "Fair. You disagree. I dislike it." "That is not the same thing." "No." She waited. He rubbed one thumb over a burned scar on his wrist. "There is an empty room behind the forge. Used to store tack. If you want a clinic, it could be made clean." Julia stared. "A clinic? You nurse half the town out of my cabin already. Might as well give them a door." "I have no certificate." "Brand has your bag. The wash took it. Or someone took it before I could look. Then we write to St. Louis. Letters take weeks, doors take less." Her heart beat harder. A clinic, not charity. Work. A place where she could stand under her own name. "I cannot pay rent yet," she said. I need someone to keep accounts and stop children from bleeding on my horseshoes. That is not a fair trade. It is if I say I need it. Angus, he looked at her, steady and stubborn. You said you would earn your keep, he said. I am letting you. So they cleared the tack room. Angus built shelves from pine boards. Julia scrubbed the floor until her arms shook. Caleb Carter painted a crooked sign that said, Nurse Hartwell. And his little sister added 3 flowers that looked like cheerful explosions. When they hung it beside the forge door, townspeople slowed to read it. Silas Brand rode past on a bay horse and did not slow at all. That evening, Julia stood beneath the sign long after sunset. Angus came beside her. Crooked, the sign, the flowers, they are perfect. He glanced down at her. You are hard to please in some matters and easy in others. I know the difference between careless and sincere. The words hung there, warmer than the forge. Angus looked away first. Storm coming. Julia looked west. Clouds gathered like bruises. Fun. We had better latch the windows, she said. They worked side by side as wind crossed the yard. Neither of them said that something else was coming too. The trouble arrived in a cream-colored carriage with brass lamps, and a driver wearing gloves too white for mercy crossing dust. Julia saw it from the clinic window while wrapping Thomas' burned arm. The carriage stopped in front of Dr. Mercer's office. A man stepped down, tall and narrow, dressed in a dark suit that belonged in a bank, not a cattle town. His hair was silver at the temples, his boots polished, and his eyes moved over the street like he was counting what could be owned. Angus came in from the forge wiping his hands. He followed Julia's gaze. Clayton Voss, he said. Who is he? Owns the freight contracts north of here. Money and stage lines, cattle notes, timber rights. Brand breathes when Voss permits it. Julia's skin chilled. And Dr. Mercer likes men who can make him important. The man in the suit disappeared into the doctor's office. Thomas muttered something in Spanish under his breath. Julia tied off the bandage. That sounds unkind. It was, Thomas said. And true. By afternoon, the town's air had changed. Men who had nodded at Julia in the morning crossed the street by supper. Mrs. Pike collected a jar of salve but left without meeting her eyes. Reverend Bell came at dusk, hat crushed in his hands. Miss Hartwell, he said, there is talk. There has been talk since I arrived. This is worse. Angus stood near the forge door, silent. The Reverend swallowed. Mr. Voss claims a bank draft. Went missing from his strongbox on the same stage that carried you. Julia stared. What? He says the wreck was searched. Your carpet bag was found beneath the freight tarp. Me carpet bag was lost. It has been found. Hope flashed first, foolish and bright. My certificate. The Reverend looked away. Julia understood before he spoke. They found no certificate. Only a torn dress, some nursing tools, and a bank draft, bearing Voss's seal. The clinic tilted around her. Angus' voice came low. Where is the bag now? Sheriff has it. Sheriff Pike takes orders from Voss, Angus said. Reverend Bell winced. Angus, truth is not slander. Julia pressed her good hand to the table. The old shame rose swift and poisonous. Too poor, too late. Too plain to be believed, too alone to defend. I did not steal anything, she said. I believe you, Reverend Bell answered. She looked at Angus. I know, he said. Not believe. No, that nearly broke her. By next morning, the rumor had teeth. The missing bank draft became stolen gold. Her nursing tools became thieves' picks. Her lost certificate became proof she had never been a nurse at all. A woman who had been almost sold could easily become a woman who deserved selling. Dr. Mercer posted a notice outside his office, warning citizens against receiving medical attention from unlicensed persons. He did not name Julia, because cowards often preferred clean ink. Julia opened the clinic anyway. Only one patient came before noon. Caleb Carter, carrying a dead sparrow in his hands, and asking if anything could be done. Julia buried the bird with him behind the forge, and let him cry without telling him boys should not. When she returned, Angus was waiting. "I am going to the sheriff." "No," she said. His brows drew together. "No, not with a hammer in your hand and murder in your face. I do not murder, I know. But people believe what suits them." He looked toward the street. "Then we let them corner you. We find proof. The stage wreck. There, brand. Move the wreckage. Pieces remain. Road is 12 miles out. I can ride. You can sit a wagon. Fine. I can sit a wagon with determination, despite everything." A breath of laughter escaped him. They left before dawn the next day, driving the blacksmith's wagon along the north road, while mist lay low in the draws. Julia wore Angus' old coat over her dress. It was too large and smelled faintly of smoke. She told herself the comfort of it was only warmth. At the wreck site, grass had been crushed, and the earth scarred where the stage had overturned. Broken glass still glittered in the weeds. Julia's stomach tightened at the memory. The scream of horses, the terrible lurch, bodies thrown together, the sound of wood splitting. She remembered crawling through mud, her hand cut open, calling for anyone who could hear. Angus searched without rushing. He found splintered spokes, torn leather, a cracked lamp bracket. Julia found a strip of her carpetbag lining caught on mesquite. Then Angus crouched near a rut and lifted something small between finger and thumb. A sliver of metal. He held it to the light. Axle bolt shaving. From the file cut. Could prove tampering. With more, they searched another hour. Julia's ribs ached. Angus noticed but said nothing, only brought the wagon closer when she tired. At last, beneath a flat stone near the wash, she saw paper half buried in dried mud. Her heart lurched. She eased it free. Not paper, a card, water-stained, torn at one corner, but legible. Hartwell, Julia, graduate nurse, St. Agathias, Charity, Hospital, St. Louis. Julia sat down in the dirt. Angus came to her side. "You found it." She held the card so tightly it trembled. It was not the full certificate. It would not prove everything, but it proved she had not invented herself. Tears slipped before she could stop them. "I was beginning to feel," she whispered. If I had dreamed my own life." Angus knelt, not too close. "You did not." She wiped her cheek angrily. "I hate crying. I don't much enjoy watching it. That is not comforting. I am poor at comfort." "No." She looked at him. "You are careful with it." The wind moved through the wash. For one moment, the whole world was only dust, broken wood, and a man kneeling beside her, as if her small proof mattered more than gold. Then a rifle clicked. Angus rose slowly. Two riders emerged from behind the cottonwoods. Silas Brand sat one horse. The lean man from the auction sat the other, rifle aimed. "Well," Silas said, "look what came crawling back to the wreck." Julia stood, card clutched in her bandaged hand. Angus stepped in front of her. Silas sighed. "Always between, aren't you? Between debtor and law, between thief and consequence, between a lonely bed and the first woman helpless enough to fill it." Angus went very still. Julia felt the words strike him. They had been chosen with care. "Leave," Angus said. Silas smiled. "Mr. Voss wants his property returned." "I am not his property," Julia said. "No, Miss Hartwell, you are his problem." Silas's gaze dropped to the card in her hand. "And problems become simpler without scraps of paper." The rifle shifted toward her. Angus moved. It happened fast. He flung a handful of dirt into the gunman's eyes, shoved Julia behind the wagon, and caught the rifle barrel as it fired. The shot cracked past the horses. One reared. Silas cursed. Angus dragged the gunman from the saddle, but the man landed a blow to Angus's ribs with the stock. Julia saw Silas spur toward her. Fear did not freeze her. It clarified. She snatched the cracked lamp bracket from the wagon bed and swung with every ounce of strength left in her. It struck Silas's wrist. He shouted and dropped his pistol. Angus turned at the sound, blood at his mouth, and finished the fight with one brutal punch that sent the gunman flat. Silas clutched his wrist and backed his horse away. "You just bought yourself ruinin'," he spat. Julia lifted her chin, shaking all over. "No, I refused it." Silas rode off with his man staggering after. Angus leaned against the wagon. "You're bleeding," Julia said. "Ah? S-O-R-U." She looked down. Her hand had reopened. The card was smeared red at the edge. Angus's face tightened. "Julia, I have it," she said, holding up the card. His expression shifted then, from pain to something deeper. "You hit him with a lamp bracket," he said. "He irritated me." A laugh broke out of Angus, rough and surprised. It lasted only a second before his ribs punished him, but Julia smiled through her tears. On the ride home, she cleaned his split lip while the wagon rolled. He complained once that she dabbed like a schoolmarm, punishing ink stains. She told him to suffer bravely. They reached Mercy Crossing at dusk. Sheriff Pike waited outside the forge, with Clayton Voss, Dr. Mercer, and half the town behind them. The sheriff held papers. "Julia Hartwell, you are to come with me." Angus climbed down first. "On what charge?" "Theft of a bank draft and assault on Mr. Brann." Julia stepped down beside him before he could help her. Her legs shook. She stood anyway. Voss smiled. "There is no need for further ugliness. The woman can work off her debt in one of my hospital camps. Remote, but respectable." Julia saw the trap. A camp no one visited. A debt no one counted fairly. A life swallowed under the name of mercy. Angus saw it too. "No," he said. Voss turned his smile on him. "You have said that word often, Mr. Fitzroy. It is not a legal argument." Julia held up the stained card. "I am a nurse. I can prove who I am." Dr. Mercer scoffed. "A card from a charity hospital. Easily forged." Reverend Bell pushed through the crowd. "Let me see it." Voss' eyes hardened. "This is sheriff's business, and moral business," the Reverend said. Before anyone could move, Mrs. Carter stepped from the crowd, pale but standing. "That woman saved my life." Thomas came beside her. "She treated my burn." Old Mr. Vale lifted his cane. "And my cough, though she scolded me like my dead mother." A few people chuckled nervously. Voss raised his hand. "Good deeds do not erase theft." "No," Julia said, "but lies do not create it." The sheriff took her arm. Angus caught his wrist. Not hard enough to break. Hard enough to promise he could. "Careful," Angus said. Sheriff Pike swallowed. "I have a warrant. From a judge. From Mr. Voss's magistrate in Abilene. That is not Mercy Crossing law." Voss's voice cooled. "You are becoming expensive, Blacksmith." Angus released the sheriff and looked at Julia. He wanted to fight. She could feel it. Wanted to put himself between her and every hand reaching. But rescue without choice was another kind of rope. Julia stepped forward. "I will go to the jail," she said. Angus turned. "Julia, I will not run like a thief." Voss's smile returned. Julia looked at the crowd, forcing each word past fear. "And tomorrow when you gather to watch again, remember this. I did not hide. I did not lie. I did not belong on that auction block. And I do not belong in chains. If this town still has a conscience, bring it with you." She walked to the jail under her own power. Behind her, Angus Fitzroy stood in the street with fists at his sides, looking like a man being forged in fire. The jail cell smelled of dust, old straw, and iron gone sour with age. Julia sat on the narrow cot while night pressed against the barred window. Her body hurt in layers. Hand, ribs, shoulder, pride. The sheriff's wife brought a plate of beans and would not meet her eyes. "Thank you," Julia said anyway. Mrs. Pike paused at the door. She was Hester Pike, the woman with the torn glove and the mean tongue. now stripped of some certainty by lamplight. My youngest had croup 2 winters ago. Hester said abruptly. Dr. Mercer was drunk. Angus rode through sleet to fetch my sister from Elk Creek, because she knew steam poultices. He never told anyone. Julia waited. He is a hard man to take. He does not seem to do things for tanks. No, Hester said. That makes it worse somehow. She left the plate and went away. Julia ate because courage required strength. Across town, Angus did not sleep. He went first to the forge and took from beneath a loose floorboard a small tin box. Inside lay everything he had not spent since Eleanor and Ruth died. Coins, banked notes, a gold ring wrapped in cloth, and the deed to his cabin. He placed them on the table and stared. Then he went to the shelf and took down the wooden horse. Ruth had loved horses but feared real ones. He had carved it during the winter she turned 3. One leg was shorter than the others. Eleanor had laughed and said it looked like half the colts in spring. Angus held it until dawn. When the sky paled, he hitched his horse and rode to every ranch within 8 miles. He did not ask for charity. He asked who owed Julia Hartwell for care. He asked who had seen Silas Brand near the stage yard before the wreck. He asked who had sold files small enough to cut axle bolts. He asked who had been quiet too long. By noon he had 12 coins, 3 signed statements, 1 apology, and a bruise under his eye from a freight man who thought loyalty to Voss required fists. By afternoon, he rode to the railroad camp where Voss sent injured workers when they became inconvenient. He found men with badly set bones, unpaid wages, and stories of nurses hired cheap and trapped by false debt. One old cook remembered a woman named Clara Baines who had disappeared after refusing Clayton Voss's contract. She said she had written to St. Louis about missing funds, the cook said. Then Brand came. Next morning, gone. Angus felt the old anger rise, black and hot. This time he did not let it blind him. Write it, he said. I don't write. Then speak it to someone who does. He brought the cook back in the wagon. At sunset, Angus went to the telegraph office and paid with Eleanor's ring. The clerk stared. This is too much. Send to St. Agatha's Charity Hospital in St. Louis. Ask if Julia M. Hartwell graduated nurse training. Ask if any certificate duplicate can be confirmed by wire. That might take. Send it. The clerk looked at Angus's face and stopped explaining. That night, Julia woke to a soft scrape at the jail window. She sat up. Who's there? Man with poor manners. She crossed to the bars. Angus stood outside in darkness, hat low, one eye shadowed by swelling. You look terrible, she whispered. You should see the other fool. Despite herself, she smiled. Then she saw his expression. What did you do? Sold some things. Angus, I needed telegraph money. What things? He did not answer. Her heart sank. Not your cabin, no. Your forge, no. She looked at him through the bars, and an understanding came slowly. The ring, she said. His silence confirmed it. Julia pressed her forehead against the cool iron. That was hers. It was sitting in a box. It was memory. It still is. You should not have done that for me. His voice roughened. I did not do it for you only. Then, for what? For the man I became after they died. The one who kept his door closed, because opening it might cost him again. He stepped closer. I watched them put a rope around you, Julia. I watched this town weigh you against convenience. I have been strong all my life in ways that did not matter. I can swing a hammer. I can bend iron. I can scare cowards back a step. But if I let them take you because I was afraid to lose more, then I'm not strong. I am only large. Julia gripped the bars. He looked at her hand, then her face. I know you don't need owning. You don't need a savior. But you have a fight, and I am asking leave to stand in it. The words entered her like warmth after fever. You have leave, she whispered. A breath left him. But Angus, yes, when this is over, Do not hand me a life paid for with ghosts. Stand with me because you want a future, not because you are trying to repay the debt." He closed his eyes briefly. When he opened them, they shone in the dark. "I want the future." The honesty of it frightened them both. Before either could say more, footsteps sounded inside the jail. Angus stepped back into shadow as Sheriff Pike entered with a lamp. "Talking to rats?" the sheriff asked. Julia turned. One very large rat. Angus disappeared into the night. The next morning, Mercy Crossing gathered again at the courthouse steps. This time there was no rope, no auction table, no gavel. Yet the same appetite lived in the crowd, sharpened by guilt and curiosity. Clayton Voss stood beside Sheriff Pike, clean as a knife. Silas Brand wore a bandage around his wrist. Dr. Mercer held Julia's stained nurse card between two fingers as if it might infect him. Julia was brought from the jail. She expected shame to return when faces turned toward her. It did, but something else came with it. Anger. Not wild, not reckless, clean anger. The kind that stands up straight. Angus waited near the forge side of the square with Reverend Bell, Millie Carter, Tomas, old Mr. Vale, and a railroad cook. More people stood near them than Julia expected. Voss began smoothly. "Citizens of Mercy Crossing, I regret that compassion has made this matter untidy. Miss Hartwell might have performed small services, but criminals often seek trust. The stolen draft was found among her belongings. She assaulted Mr. Brand. She has no official papers beyond a damaged card of doubtful origin. Because my belongings were taken after the wreck," Julia said. Voss's smile did not falter. "A convenient claim." Angus stepped forward. "SO is finding your own draft in a bag you controlled." Silas snapped. "You accuse Mr. Voss." I accuse whoever filed that bolt." Murmurs rose. Angus held up the metal shaving and 3 signed statements. Brand's driver admitted the stage had been ordered out, though the wheel shook. Livery boy saw Brand at the axle with a file the night before departure. Freight man sold him the file. Silas went pale. Lies. The livery boy, barely 16, stepped from behind Reverend Bell. His voice shook. "I saw him. He told me I'd lose my job if I spoke." Voss's eyes turned deadly. Frightened boys say much under pressure. The railroad cook lifted his hand. "So do frightened old men. Voss done this before. Puts money in women's bags, claims debt, sends them where no one hears from them." The crowd stirred harder now. Dr. Mercer barked. "Ridiculous." Julia looked at him. "You knew there was no nurse position when you sent the letter, didn't you?" Mercer stiffened. She turned to the crowd. "I received a letter promising employment. When I arrived injured, Dr. Mercer dismissed me before examining my credentials. Mr. Brand claimed debt. Mr. Voss offered a camp. How many women before me were promised work and delivered into bondage? No one breathed." Voss laughed softly. "Bondage? Dramatic language from a woman who owes money." Angus reached into his coat and took out a paper. "I bought the debt," he said. Julia's head whipped toward him. Voss's smile sharpened. "Then you admit there is one?" "No. I bought what Brand claimed so he could no longer use it." "You paid with deed collateral." Julia's heart plunged. "Angus, no." He did not look away from Voss. "My forge and cabin against her alleged account, held by Reverend Bell until a circuit judge reviews the matter." Voss looked delighted. "Then, if the judge finds against her, your property is mine." "Yes." The square erupted. Julia stepped toward Angus, fury and fear choking her. "You had no right." He turned then, and the pain in his face silenced her. "No," he said quietly. "I did not. But I had a choice between risking what I own and watching them use money like a rope again. That is your home. It was a house before you walked into it." The words struck the whole square, though he had spoken them only to her. Voss clapped once, slow, touching. But a duplicate sentiment is not a duplicate certificate at that moment. The telegraph clerk ran from his office, weaving a yellow slip wire from St. Louis. The town seemed to freeze. He thrust the paper into Reverend Bell's hands. The Reverend read, adjusted his spectacles, and read again louder. St. Agatha's Charity Hospital confirms Julia Meredith Hartwell completed nurse training with distinction. Certificate issued June 12, 1883. Duplicate documents can be mailed upon request. Hospital records also confirm inquiry filed by Miss Hartwell regarding suspicious recruitment letters sent west under false medical appointment offers. The words roll through Mercy, crossing like thunder, finally reaching dry land. Julia closed her eyes with distinction. Her life has spoken back. Voss reached for the paper. Angus blocked him. Sheriff Pike removed his hat, face gray. Mr. Voss, I reckon we need to hold this matter for Judge Wilkes. Voss's expression hardened into something bare and ugly. You reckon wrong. He turned, seized Dr. Mercer's pistol from its holster, and aimed at Julia. Angus moved, but Julia was closer to the clinic door. She did not run away. She stepped sideways, drawing the aim from the crowd. Voss snarled. You should have stayed unwanted before he could fire. Hester Pike swung her parasol into his arm with all the force of a woman who had been waiting years to strike someone properly. The shot went wide, splintering the auction post. Angus hit Voss from the other side, driving him to the ground. The sheriff kicked the pistol away. Silas Brand tried to flee and was tripped by Caleb Carter, who looked surprised by his own bravery. The square exploded into movement. Men grabbed Voss. Sheriff Pike cuffed Brand with shaking hands. Dr. Mercer backed into old Mr. Val's cane and sat down hard in the dust. Julia stood beneath the courthouse steps, breathing like she had run miles. Angus came to her. You hurt? He asked. No. You're sure? No. That startled a laugh from him, broken and relieved. Julia looked past him at the auction post, its wood scarred by the bullet. Then she looked at the place where the rope had fallen weeks before. The town saw it too. One by one, hats came off. Not applause, not celebration. Something quieter and harder. Shame finding its knees. Judge Wilkes arrived 3 days later in a mud-splashed buggy, irritated at being summoned and more irritated by what he found. He spent 2 days hearing statements in the church, where the pews filled with ranchers, mothers, railroad men, and townspeople who had learned that silence could be a kind of signature. Clayton Voss's papers were clever, but not clean. Silas Brand's ledger contradicted itself in 4 places. Dr. Mercer's recruitment letters bore Voss's seal beneath a false hospital name. The stolen bank draft had never been cashed because it had never been meant to be money. It had been bait. When the judge struck his cane against the floor and declared Julia Hartwell free of all debt and accusation, Mercy Crossing let out a sound like a held breath escaping. Angus did not cheer. He simply sat forward, elbows on knees, hands clasped, as if afraid sudden movement might wake him. Julia stood. Your Honor, she said, there is the matter of Mr. Fitzroy's deed. The judge glanced at Reverend Bell, who produced the document. No lawful debt existed, Judge Wilkes said. No collateral can be claimed. He handed the deed to Julia. Since he was fool enough to risk it, you may return it. A ripple of laughter moved through the church. Julia took the deed and walked to Angus. He rose slowly. She placed it in his hand. Never do that again without asking me. His eyes warmed. Yes, Nurse Hartwell. You mean it. I heard you. And thank you. He closed his fingers around the deed. I heard that too. Judge Wilkes sentenced Brand to await trial under guard. Voss would be carried to Laramie under federal warrant once more testimony could be gathered from the railroad camps. Dr. Mercer lost his license pending inquiry, which made him sputter until Mrs. Bell asked if he needed smelling salts. By the end of the week, Mercy Crossing was a town trying to mend itself, and discovering mending was slower than tearing. People came to Julia's clinic with more than coughs and cuts. They came with jars of peaches, a repaired shawl, 2 chickens, a real painted sign, and apologies that stumbled but arrived. Mrs. Pike came last. She stood in the clinic doorway, twisting her gloves. I was cruel. Julia looked up from grinding willow bark. Yes, Hester swallowed. I was afraid. That might explain it. It does not excuse it. No. The two women regarded each other. Hester lifted a basket. I brought linen. For bandages. Julia accepted it. Thank you. Hester nodded, then glanced toward the forge where Angus hammered a wagon rim. He looks less like a thundercloud lately. He still rumbles. Ice. But not at everyone. When she left, Julia stood listening to the hammer. The sound no longer seemed like the only honest thing in town. It seemed like part of a larger music. Wagon wheels, children running, clinic door opening, kettle singing, horses blowing in the corral. Noise in a house built for it. But one matter remained unspoken. 2 evenings after the trial, Julia found Angus behind the cabin repairing the fence. Sunset burned copper over the creek. The blue vase sat in the open window with fresh wildflowers, properly cut this time. Your clinic has 3 patients waiting tomorrow, Angus said. Our clinic has 3 patients. He looked over. Julia folded her arms carefully. You built the shelves. You do the nursing. You scare away fools. You do that fine yourself. She smiled. Then the smile faded under the weight of what she had come to say. My duplicate certificate will arrive in a few weeks, she said. Judge Wilkes knows a doctor's widow in Cheyenne who runs a proper infirmary. She needs trained nurses. Angus went still. It would be good work, Julia continued. Paid work, respected work. His hand tightened on the fence rail. Does, he said. I have spent a long time wanting a door no one could push me out of. You deserve one, I know. Her voice softened. That is why I'm deciding carefully which door I choose. He turned fully then. The sunset caught the scar at his jaw, the gray in his eyes, the worn strength of a man who had once mistaken loneliness for penance. Julia loved him in that moment, with a tenderness so fierce it frightened her. Not because he had stopped an auction, not because he had risked his home, but because he had asked leave to stand with her, and had learned that her courage was not something to carry, but something to honor. I will not ask you to stay, he said. I know. I want to. I know that too. He looked toward the creek. This house was built for Eleanor and Ruth, for a life that ended. Julia stepped closer. Do you feel guilty wanting another? His face tightened. Every day. Then let me say something as a nurse. That sounds dangerous. That sounds dangerous. It is. She took the fence rail beside his hand. The heart is not a graveyard unless we make it one. Love buried there can feed what grows next. It does not have to forbid it. Angus closed his eyes. When he opened them, the loneliness had not vanished. But it no longer stood alone. I do not have fine words, he said. I have heard plenty. They are overrated. I can give you a room that locks from your side. She smiled. A clinic door with your name on it, he continued. Coffee too strong. Shelves that might lean. A man who will sometimes be foolish and require correction. Frequently. He agreed. And if you choose Cheyenne, I will hitch the wagon and take you there myself. Julia's throat tightened. That, she whispered, is why I'm not choosing Cheyenne. He stared at her. She drew a folded paper from her apron pocket. It was the offer Judge Wilkes had written. Across the bottom, in Julia's neat hand, she had written a refusal. I am choosing Mercy Crossing, she said. Not because it was kind, because it must learn to be. I am choosing the clinic. I am choosing my own name. And if he still wants the future, I am choosing Angus Fitzroy. For a moment, the only sound was the creak. Then Angus took off his hat like a man in church. He wants it. Julia laughed softly, and that became tears, and Angus looked alarmed until she stepped into him. He held her with careful strength, mindful of every place still healing. His arms did not claim. They sheltered. When he bent his head, he paused. My eye. Julia smiled through tears. Yes, their first kiss was not grand enough for songs. It was gentle, a little uncertain, and full of all the words they had saved by living them instead. They were married 6 weeks later beneath the cottonwoods beside the church. Julia wore a cream dress sewn by Millie Carter and Hester Pike together, which nearly caused a second town crisis. Angus wore a black coat that made Caleb whisper he looked like a preacher who could lift an ox. Reverend Bell spoke of mercy, courage, and doors opened after sorrow. No one mentioned the auction until the vows were done. Then Angus led Julia across the square. People followed, curious. The courthouse steps had been repaired. The bullet-scarred auction post remained, though Silas Brand's platform was gone. Angus had asked the judge for the old gavel, the one Silas had raised over Julia, as if naming a price. It had been evidence. Now it was released. Angus set a small iron stand in the exact place where Julia had stood with a rope around her waist. On it, he placed the gavel. The crowd quieted. Julia looked at him, puzzled. Angus took his blacksmith's hammer from Caleb, who had carried it proudly. He handed it to Julia. "Only if you want," he said. She understood then. Her hand had healed. A faint scar crossed the palm, silver in the sun. She wrapped her fingers around the hammer. It was heavy, too heavy for the woman Silas Brand had called cheap, injured, and quiet. Angus stood beside her, not touching, not guiding. Julia lifted the hammer and brought it down. The gavel split in two. The sound cracked across Mercy, crossing like a chain breaking. No one laughed. No one looked away. Then Hester Pike began clapping. Millie joined. Thomas. Reverend Bell. Old Mr. Vale thumped his cane so hard, he nearly lost balance. Caleb shouted until his little sister shouted louder. Julia handed the hammer back to Angus. He leaned close. "You swing well for a nurse. You should see me with a lamp bracket." His laugh rolled warm over the square. Together they carried the broken gavel to the forge. Angus heated the metal band that had held its head, and Julia watched as he worked it free. He did not destroy that part. Instead, he shaped it into a small iron ring and set it into the frame above the clinic door, not as a memory of shame, but as a warning to shame itself. Years later, people in Mercy Crossing would point to that ring and tell newcomers the story wrong in a dozen ways. Some said Angus Fitzroy had thrown Silas Brand through a window. Some said Julia Hartwell had outdrawn Clayton Voss. Caleb Carter, grown tall, insisted the lamp bracket had been as big as a saber. Julia always corrected them. No, she would say from the clinic doorway, with Angus's forge ringing beside her. It was not strength that saved me first. It was being seen as human when the crowd had forgotten how. And Angus, older, grayer, still soot-marked and broad-shouldered, would look up from his anvil with that quiet smile only Julia could summon. The forge and clinic stood side by side for the rest of their days. Injured riders came to her door. Broken wagons came to his. Children ran between both as if healing and mending were one trade. On winter evenings, the cabin glowed with lamplight, coffee, wildflowers dried in the blue vase, and chairs scraping around a table finally full of noise. No rope ever crossed Julia's waist again. No gavel ever named her price. And when the sun set over Mercy Crossing, its last gold often touched the sign above the forge-side clinic, where iron held firm around painted letters that wind, dust, and time could not erase. Nurse Julia Hartwell Fitzroy. Beside it, Angus' anvil rang into the evening, steady and patient, like a promise still being kept.